She said she couldn't bear to let them rot. The jars said otherwise. In 1895, in the remote Georgia plains, a widow began preserving the bodies of her victims in honey. But she wasn't just keeping them, she was collecting their souls. To her, the honey wasn't just a preservative, it was a vessel that trapped the very essence of life. As the bodies piled up, so did the whispers, growing louder and more demanding. But the real question wasn't why she did it, was how far she would go to capture even more souls. And what would happen when the honey itself turned against her? In the quiet, desolate heart of Georgia, a widow named Eleanor was left alone after the sudden death of her husband, Samuel. He was everything to her life, her reason for living, and now he was gone. The doctor said it was a fever, something so common, so easily ignored, yet it took him in a matter of days. She was devastated, consumed by grief. Every corner of her home echoed with his absence, and the empty space in their bed seemed to mock her. The world outside continued to turn, but she felt as though she were drowning in time itself. Days blurred into nights. Eleanor's obsession with Samuel's death grew stronger, and she found herself staring at his body, unable to accept the inevitable. His body, now stiff with rigor mortis, was not the man she had loved. She could let him go. His spirit, she believed, was still tethered to the earthly realm. But if she could preserve him, keep his body from decaying, perhaps he would remain with her forever. She couldn't stand the thought of him rotting away, couldn't bear it. So Eleanor did what no one else would have dared. She gathered what she could, a few jars, honey, herbs, and began her macabre ritual. The honey was the key, she believed. Its sticky golden essence could halt decay, preserve life. She had read about the ancient practice of mummification, of bodies sealed in honey to preserve them for eternity. Wasn't this just another form of that? She was simply following a tradition, just one that no one had dared to practice in ages. As she worked, her hands trembled. The ritual felt wrong, yet it felt like the only thing that could bring her peace. But as the honey poured over Samuel's body, something unusual happened. At first, she thought it was just the shock of grief, playing tricks on her. But no, it was real. His body, cold and still, seemed to shift ever so slightly under the weight of the syrupy substance. A whisper seemed to call her name. At first, she brushed it off as a figment of her imagination. Grief had made her mind brittle, hadn't it? The whisper came again, louder this time. Eleanor. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked at Samuel's face, his features now submerged in honey, his eyes closed forever. She could feel him. Feel him. She reached for his hand, and a cold shiver ran through her. The sensation of life's soul perhaps lingered just beneath the surface. It wasn't just a body she was preserving. She was keeping his essence, his spirit, bound to this world. Eleanor hadn't just been trying to stop him from rotting, she had been trying to keep him alive. For days, she couldn't stop herself from staring at the honey jars. She watched as they sealed the souls of the lost, as they became something else, as something trapped but also preserved. Samuel's jar seemed to hum with energy, his body frozen in time but somehow more alive. The whispers didn't stop. At night, she would wake to the sound of his voice calling to her. Eleanor. Him still here, she began to wonder if she could preserve not just Samuel but others. If the honey could trap spirits, hold them at bay, and keep them from moving on, could it be possible to give others eternal life too? Perhaps she wasn't just preserving body as she was saving souls. The idea of collecting souls consumed her thoughts. She couldn't stop herself, couldn't resist. What if there were others out there, just as lost and in need of preservation as Samuel? What if she could bring them peace too? She told herself she wasn't a killer. She wasn't murdering anyone. She was offering salvation, and the honey was the key. It wasn't long before Eleanor's obsession led her to the first victim, an innocent farmhand named Thomas, who had recently lost his wife. He had come to her for help, seeking shelter from a storm. He was lonely, grieving, and she saw in him an opportunity. He would be her next project, her next soul to save. That night, Eleanor made her move. She prepared. The honey once more, the air thick with anticipation. Thomas sat at her kitchen table, eating the warm stew she had prepared. She had been so kind, so gentle with him. But underneath it all, something darker brewed. She watched him, her eyes lingering longer than necessary. Thomas was vulnerable, and she knew she had to act quickly before he realized the danger he was in. The moment he finished his meal, Eleanor led him to the cellar. She told him it was where she kept the herbs, but as he followed her, he began to notice the jars large, glass containers filled with honey and something else. Bodies? He froze, confusion turning to fear. Before he could protest, Eleanor was upon him. She forced him down onto the stone floor, whispering that this was for his own good, that she was saving him. The honey was already prepared, and she began to pour it over his body, just as she had done with Samuel. But this time, something was different. The honey didn't just preserve him, it changed him. It was as though the very essence of his soul was sucked into the thick, golden syrup. His body jerked, and a low growl escaped from deep within him. His eyes rolled back in his head, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Eleanor's heart raced as she watched, her hands trembling. This was more than she had ever expected. She had never felt the power of the honey like this before. As she sealed him in the jar, his body lifeless and unmoving, she realized that she had done something far darker than she had anticipated. The honey wasn't just keeping him alive. It was trapping him, locking him away, and now she could hear his soul screaming within the glass. But Eleanor refused to believe it. She told herself this was just part of the process, just another soul to be saved. She had done the right thing. Hadn't she? The voices from the jars seemed to grow stronger, more insistent, as if they were trying to tell her something, but Eleanor ignored them, her conviction unwavering. And that's when she realized something far more disturbing. The honey wasn't just preserving bodies, it was feeding on their souls. But the whispers didn't stop. The souls she had collected were no longer silent, and they weren't just asking for release, they were demanding something far worse. Eleanor's obsession with the honey jars grew with each passing day. Her home, once filled with the warmth of love, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in around her. But this new world she had built, this strange, unsettling world where souls were preserved and honey became her refuge. Samuel's jar sat at the center of her home, glowing faintly in the dim light of the evening. It was a constant reminder that she was doing the right thing. She was saving them, but deep inside, something gnawed at her, a growing sense of dread that she couldn't shake. And that's when she saw him, Thomas, the farmhand, trapped in his jar. His body remained lifeless, but the faintest movement within the honey told her that something was alive inside. The whispers from the jar began again, louder now, urging her to continue her work. It wasn't enough, they said. One soul wasn't enough. She needed more. But who? Eleanor's mind raced, and then it hit her. There was someone nearby, a lonely, grieving man who had recently lost his wife. He was weak, vulnerable, just like Thomas. His name was John, a widower who had been seen wandering the fields, his heart broken by the loss of his beloved. He had nowhere to go, no family left. She could help him. She could save him, just like she had saved Thomas. At first, she hesitated. There was a part of her that wondered if what she was doing was wrong. The voice of her conscience whispered faintly, telling her to stop, leave John be. But the whispers from the jar's Thomas voice, Samuel's voice, all the voices grew louder. They were demanding her to continue, to fill the jars with more souls. You can save him too, Eleanor. You're the only one who can. That was all it took. The decision was made. Eleanor set out to find John. It wasn't hard. He was a creature of habit, wandering through the plains as if looking for something he couldn't name. She found him by the old creek, hunched over, his clothes ragged, eyes hollow with grief. His life had crumbled, and Eleanor could see it in his eyes, the emptiness, the longing for something that could never return. She approached him slowly, her voice soft, almost tender. "John, you look tired," she said, her eyes filled with sympathy. "Come inside. I'll make you something to eat. You don't have to be alone." He looked up, his eyes vacant at first, then slowly focusing on her face. His lips parted in a weak smile, and he nodded. I don't have anywhere else to go." Eleanor led him back to her home, feeling the weight of the decision heavy in her chest. She hadn't realized just how much she needed to do, how much she needed to keep filling the jars. She needed more. She needed control. The thought consumed her as they walked. Once inside, Eleanor prepared a small meal for John, all the while watching him closely. She needed him to trust her. She needed him to believe in her kindness, and he did. He ate in silence, not questioning her, not even aware of the deadly trap she was setting for him. His grief clouded his mind, and his desperation to find solace in any form made him the perfect target. After he finished eating, Eleanor invited him to rest in the back room, where the honey jars lay hidden from view. She told him it was a place where she kept her herbs and salves for the sick. John, exhausted, agreed, and she led him into the darkened room. The air smelled faintly of honey and something else, something darker. Once inside, she moved swiftly, locking the door behind them. John turned to her, a look of confusion in his eyes. "What's going on? Where are we?" Before he could finish his sentence, Eleanor lunged at him. Her hands were quicker than he could react, and she shoved him to the floor. He struggled, but her strength was unlike anything he had anticipated. She was frantic now, her hands shaking as she prepared the honey. The smell of it filled the room, thick and cloying. John gasped for breath, his confusion turning into panic. "Eleanor, please, what are you doing?" His voice trembled, but Eleanor was beyond hearing him. She was lost in her work. The honey had to flow. The jar had to be filled. As she poured the honey over his body, John's body stiffened. His eyes grew wide in horror as he realized what was happening. "No, no," he screamed, but it was too late. The honey seeped into his skin, and Eleanor felt his soul struggle against her. He fought, he screamed, but it was all in vain. The honey was already working its magic, sucking his very essence into the thick golden syrup. But something unexpected happened. As John's body became still, the jar began to glow. Not like Samuel's jar, which was calm and steady. This one pulsed with an eerie light, the honey swirling inside. Eleanor's heart raced. The whispering from the jars had stopped except for one. It was John's soul, but it was different, angrier. A cold chill ran through her, and she staggered back, looking at the jar in fear. She hadn't expected this. John's spirit wasn't grateful. He was furious. The whispers of the other souls seemed to laugh at her, mocking her. "You thought you could control us, Eleanor?" John's voice echoed in her mind, his anger filling the room. "You can't save us. You are just as trapped as we are." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to push the fear away. This was her plan. She was supposed to be saving him. She was supposed to be in control. But John's spirit wasn't peaceful. It wasn't grateful. It was vengeful, and his anger was consuming her thoughts, making her feel as though her very mind was being torn apart. And that was when she realized the true horror. The honey wasn't just a way to preserve souls, it was a prison that kept the souls trapped, forever angry, forever fighting to escape. She wasn't saving them. She was trapping them in an endless cycle of torment. And the more she filled the jars, the more the anger grew. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The souls she trapped were no longer her prisoners, they were becoming something far worse. And now, she wasn't just battling the dead. She was battling something far more terrifying, her own creation. Eleanor's world had changed, and she couldn't deny it anymore. Her once innocent ritual had transformed into something darker, something she could no longer control. Every night the whispers grew louder, and they weren't just voices anymore. They were alive. John's spirit, now fully trapped in the honey jar, wasn't like Samuel. His anger was a relentless storm, a force that threatened to consume her every waking moment. It gnawed at her mind, clawing at her resolve, making her question whether she had done the right thing. Her house felt different now. It felt haunted. The honey jars, once so full of promise, now glowed ominously, as if the souls inside were pushing against the glass. Each jar seemed to have a pulse of its own, as though they were alive in a way that was far more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. Eleanor tried to convince herself that this was part of the process, that the souls needed time to adjust to their new state, that the anger would subside, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The honey, she now realized, had become more than just a preservative. It had become a vessel, a prison, and something darker had taken residence inside each of her victims one night after weeks of restless sleep. Eleanor found herself standing in front of the jars again. The house was quiet, too quiet, the air thick with tension. She moved from jar to jar, staring at the bodies inside, each one sealed in honey, each one holding a soul that was not at rest. She stared at Thomas' jar, then at John's. His spirit, now a raging storm, clawed at the sides of the jar, desperate for release. She could hear him, louder than before, his voice seeping into her mind, mocking her. "You think you're saving us, Eleanor? You think you can control us?" John's voice echoed in her head, and this time, she couldn't ignore the malice behind it. "You can't save us. You've cursed us." Eleanor stepped back, a cold sweat breaking out on her brow. The whispers weren't just voices, they were becoming something more. The spirits were changing, they were evolving. She could feel their power growing, swelling, as if they were drawing energy from each other. The honey was no longer just a container for their souls. It was feeding off them, strengthening them, turning them into something more powerful. But the worst part, Eleanor could feel it too. The honey had begun to feed off her, draining her, pulling her deeper into madness. Each time she heard their voices, each time she looked into their jars, she felt her own spirit fraying, unraveling. The jar was no longer just a prison, it was a portal that was slowly consuming her soul along with the souls of the dead. And then it happened. It was subtle at first. She thought she was imagining it, but when she turned her attention to the farthest jar, the one where Samuel's body still floated, preserved in golden syrup, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A movement, not in the body but in the honey. It rippled, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The honey began to shift. The air around the jar seemed to shimmer with an energy she couldn't explain. The whispers from the other jars grew quiet, as if they too were waiting. Eleanor reached out, trembling, her hand hovering over the jar. She was drawn to it, compelled, as though something was calling her to open it, to see what was inside. The voices of the other souls, once angry and distant, now grew soft, almost pleading. Samuel's jar had become a nexus, a focal point for all the souls trapped within the honey. And then she heard it, Samuel's voice. Not the one from before, the faint whispers she had once heard in the dark of night. This was different. It was clear, almost real. Eleanor, don't open it. You don't know what you are unleashing. But it was too late. Before she could stop herself, her fingers closed around the jar's lid. The moment she twisted it open, a wave of energy washed over her, so powerful it knocked her off her feet. The air crackled with static, the room seeming to warp around her. Eleanor screamed, but the sound was lost in the explosion of energy that followed. The jar exploded in a burst of light. The honey, once so still and calm, began to boil, twisting in unnatural ways. The spirits within the honey were no longer contained. They were free, and they were furious. Eleanor tried to get up, but it felt as though her body was paralyzed, held in place by some unseen force. Her eyes were wide with terror as the souls she had trapped for so long began to rise, their forms shifting and distorting as they emerged from the broken jar. They were no longer human. They were something else, something dark, something far more powerful. Eleanor, John's voice broke through the chaos, the rage in his tone palpable. We told you we weren't yours to control. Now we're free, and we'll never let you go. The spirits swirled around her, their forms taking shape in the air phantoms of shadow and smoke. The walls of her home seemed to pulse with their power, as if they were tearing apart the very fabric of reality. The honey had changed them. It had twisted them into something worse. The longer they had been trapped inside, the stronger they became, until now they were a force she couldn't contain. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the truth finally hit her. The honey wasn't just a prison. It was a transformer. It was turning the souls into something else, something darker, more powerful than she could ever have imagined. The honey had fed on them, and now they were feeding on her. She felt it then, the pull, the weight of their collective anger. It was too much. It was overwhelming. They had become the hunters, and she had become the hunted. In the midst of the chaos, Eleanor stumbled toward the door, but before she could escape, she felt a cold hand grab her ankle, yanking her back into the room. She screamed, but the voices drowned her out. You can't escape, Eleanor, Samuel's voice echoed, now distorted, a twisted mockery of the man she once loved. You wanted to save us, but you only made us stronger. You only made us hungry. And then the spirits, no longer just the souls of the dead, but something else moved toward her. She tried to fight, but her strength was failing. The honey had drained her, taken so much of her essence that she couldn't move. Her body was no longer hers. It was as if the spirits were feeding on her, taking what little life remained. But before they could claim her completely, a thought flashed through her mind. If she could still reach the jars, if she could trap them. Again, maybe she could stop them. But as Eleanor reached for the jars, she realized something even more terrifying. The souls weren't just in the jars anymore. They were in her. Eleanor's world was collapsing around her. The walls of her once comfortable home now seemed to close in, suffocating her with every breath. The souls she had trapped twisted had grown too powerful, too demanding. And yet, in the midst of this spiraling nightmare, there was one thing she hadn't accounted for. The local sheriff, Edgar Millers, who had begun to question the string of disappearances in the area. It started with a simple visit, a routine investigation. People had gone missing, and as much as Eleanor tried to ignore it, the whispers of suspicion surrounding her grew louder. At first, Sheriff Millers dismissed the rumors as wild gossip, the kind of talk that spread in small towns, but something gnawed at him. The disappearance of travelers, the strange behavior of locals who once wandered near her home, had set off a chain reaction in his mind. Eleanor had always been a quiet, solitary woman, but recently people had noticed the oddities, her isolation, her increasing erratic behavior, the fact that her house was always locked tight, that no one seemed to come or go except for her. The sheriff had made up his mind. He was going to confront Eleanor. The next morning he arrived, on horseback, his boots crunching the gravel as he made his way to her front door. Eleanor was inside, staring at the broken jar where Samuel's soul had once been trapped. She had barely slept. The spirits were growing louder, their voices demanding release, their anger unrelenting. She had no peace. Every night it was the same. They taunted her, forced her to relive the horror of what she had done. But now, There was a new fear in the air. Sheriff Millers was on his way. As the sheriff knocked at her door, Eleanor froze. Her heart hammered in her chest. The last thing she needed was the sheriff snooping around. What if he discovered the jars? What if he realized what she had done? The honey wasn't just a preservative, it was alive, and the souls inside it were too strong now to be hidden. "Eleanor," came the sheriff's voice, rough but polite. "I'd like to have a word with you." For a moment, Eleanor considered hiding. She could lock the door, pretend she wasn't home, but that would only raise suspicion. She had to face him, play the part of the grieving widow, the kind woman who had nothing to hide. She plastered a smile on her face, her hand shaking as she opened the door. "Yes, Sheriff, how can I help you?" The sheriff looked at her for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning her face. There was something about her that felt off to him, something he couldn't quite place. "I'm here to ask you about some of the recent disappearances," he said. "You've heard about them, I'm sure?" Eleanor nodded, her throat dry. "I've heard rumors, of course. But I'm afraid I don't know anything about them, Sheriff. I've been busy." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Busy, huh? With what, exactly?" Eleanor's mind raced. She had to deflect. "I've been taking care of things around here, Sheriff. You know how it is, when you're alone." The sheriff seemed to study her for a moment. "I see. Well, it's just that people have been disappearing, Eleanor. And I found some interesting things, odd things." He paused. "Your house, for one. People around town say no one's been in or out of here for weeks except you. You haven't seen anything strange? Any unusual visitors?" Eleanor's pulse quickened. He was too close to the truth. She could feel the walls closing in, the souls inside the honey jar stirring as if they were aware of the danger. They were growing restless, angry. The honey was reacting to her fear, pulsing beneath the floorboards. "I haven't seen anyone, Sheriff," she lied, her voice shaking. "I live alone." The sheriff nodded, but he wasn't convinced. "Maybe so, but you'll need to have a look around. I think it's time I took a closer look at your property, just to be sure." Eleanor's stomach twisted. She could feel the tension building, the pressure from the souls pressing in on her. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were screams. The jars were shaking, rattling against their shelves as if they were alive. She had to do something quickly. "Well, Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but I'm afraid I've got nothing to hide." She smiled, but it was a strained, brittle thing. "Why don't you come in for some tea? You look like you could use a rest." The sheriff hesitated for a moment, still studying her, but then he nodded. "All right, Eleanor, I'll take you up on that. But after, I'm going to need to have a look inside your house, a real look. No more playing around." Eleanor led him inside, her mind spinning. She had to buy time to hide the jars, but as she turned away from the sheriff, something shifted, a presence, cold, dark, and growing stronger. The souls were awake now, fully aware of what was happening. They were feeding off her fear, feeding off the growing tension in the room. The honey jars glowed faintly, their contents shifting and swirling like smoke. Eleanor felt a pull toward them, as if the spirits were calling her, urging her to open them, to let them out. "No," she whispered to herself, but the voices only grew louder, their demands more insistent. "Eleanor," the sheriff's voice broke through the haze of her panic. "I don't mean to rush you, but we're going to need to talk about those jars of yours." Eleanor froze. "How did he know about the jars? You've been looking around?" she asked, her voice tight. The sheriff looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't have to look far, Eleanor. It's hard not to notice something odd when it's sitting in plain view." He took a step forward, glancing at the shelves where the jars sat, hidden just enough to be overlooked by casual eyes, but not his. "These jars," he continued, his tone now harder. "What's inside them?" Her heart pounded as she realized the truth. He had seen the jars. He had been inside her house when she wasn't looking. And now she had no choice but to confront him. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "Sheriff, I'm afraid you don't understand. I've been preserving them, the souls of the lost. I'm saving them." The sheriff stared at her, his face unreadable. He had known something was off, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. "Saving them?" he repeated, incredulous. "Eleanor, this isn't saving. This is madness." "No," she whispered, her voice rising. "This is the only way. I can keep them here, keep them with me. They need me." The sheriff stepped closer, his face full of concern. "You're not saving them, Eleanor. You're trapping them. They're not at peace. They're angry, they're changing." Eleanor's eyes widened in horror. He knew, and as his words sank in, she realized the truth. The souls she had collected, the ones she had trapped in Hunathay, weren't at rest. They were no longer just souls, they were something else. Suddenly, the jars shook violently. The glass cracked, the honey inside bubbling and churning as the spirits within fought to break free. The sheriff stepped back, his eyes wide with fear. "Eleanor, get away from them!" he shouted. But it was too late. The souls were free. But what they had become wasn't something the sheriff or Eleanor could ever have imagined, and now their wrath would be unleashed. The moment the jars cracked, the atmosphere in Eleanor's home shifted. It wasn't just a physical break, it was as if the very air itself had been torn apart, filled with an oppressive, suffocating energy. The honey inside the jars started to bubble, its golden liquid foaming as if alive. And then the voices, once muffled by the glass, broke free. They roared, they screamed, they were angry. The souls trapped for so long were no longer whispering, they were shouting, their rage echoing through the house like a storm trapped in a bottle. Eleanor stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror. She tried to speak, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony of angry souls surrounding her. The sheriff, equally terrified, backed toward the door, his face pale as he looked at the jars shuddering on their shelves. He could see the honey inside them moving alive. The souls were no longer mere whispers, they were transforming, and Eleanor had no idea how to stop them. "Eleanor, you need to stop this," the sheriff shouted, his voice barely audible over the clamor of the spirits. "This has gone too far." But Eleanor didn't hear him. Her mind was a swirl of confusion, fear, and something much darker. She was no longer in control. The honey, very substance she had believed would preserve and protect was now twisting into something far more terrifying. The spirits were free, and their anger was overwhelming. They were no longer innocent souls trapped by grief or loneliness. They were vengeful. They were hungry. Her own sanity felt like it was slipping away with every second, her mind unraveling in the face of the spirit's rage. The walls seemed to pulse with their energy, and the once still air was now thick with the sound of their cries. They were coming for her. "Why did you do this, Eleanor?" one of the voices said, cutting through the storm of sound like a knife. It was John's voice, the first soul she had captured, now laced with venom. His words were cold, sharp, and filled with betrayal. "You thought you could save us? You thought you could trap us forever? We are free, Eleanor. You will never escape us now." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she fell to her knees, clutching her head in pain. The sheriff, seeing the deepening horror on her face, tried again to break through her madness. "This isn't you, Eleanor. You have to listen to me," he cried, his voice desperate. "These souls are not saved. They're corrupted. You've changed them." But Eleanor couldn't listen anymore. The voices were too loud, too powerful. She wasn't hearing the sheriff. She was hearing the souls that had become twisted by the honey, by her actions. They were no longer victims. They were hunters. They were a storm of rage, each one clawing for their freedom, their release. And they weren't just after freedom anymore, they were after her. "You did this!" the souls screamed in unison, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo. "You set us free, but you didn't realize that you were setting yourself up for your own damnation." Suddenly, the room seemed to spin. Eleanor felt herself being pulled toward the jars, her body moving against her will. She tried to resist, but the force was overwhelming. The honey in the jars began to swirl faster, the golden liquid turning black and thick. It was as if the spirits inside were merging, combining their power into one massive entity. And then, in a blinding flash of light, the spirits erupted from the jars. Eleanor screamed in terror as she felt their presence fill the room, surrounding her, pressing in on her from every side. They weren't human anymore. They weren't souls. They were a force, a living, breathing nightmare made of pure rage and hatred. The air grew cold, freezing her to the bone, and the darkness seemed to consume everything around her. The sheriff was caught in the maelstrom of souls, his face contorted in fear as the spirits descended upon him. But they didn't touch him. They didn't need to. Their power was not physical. It was mental, spiritual, and emotional. The sheriff's screams filled the house, but they weren't screams of pain. They were screams of insanity. The souls were in his mind now, tearing apart his thoughts, twisting his reality until he no longer knew what was real or what was a hallucination. Eleanor could feel it too. The spirits were in her, crawling under her skin, digging into her mind. She could hear their thoughts, their desires, their hatred. It was too much. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world around her blurred, and she felt her own mind begin to shatter. "You did this," the voice of Samuel, her long-lost husband, whispered to her from within the chaos. "You brought this upon us, Eleanor. You thought you could preserve us, keep us close. But you've only made us hungry. And now, We're going to feed." Her body convulsed as she felt her soul start to unravel. The honey had been a lie. It had promised preservation, but it had delivered damnation. She had been so focused on saving them, on preserving their souls, that she hadn't seen the truth. She had trapped them. And in the end, they had trapped her. The souls, now free of their glass prisons, turned their attention fully to Eleanor. They began to pull at her, dragging her into the very honey she had used to preserve them. Her screams were drowned out by the chorus of voices, each one more desperate, more vengeful than the last. "Eleanor!" the sheriff cried, his voice echoing in her ears, but his words were no longer coherent. His mind had shattered along with hers. He was nothing more than a vessel, empty and broken. The souls had consumed him too. In a final desperate attempt, Eleanor reached for the broken jar that had once contained Samuel's soul, but it was too late. The honey, now black as pitch, surged toward her like a tidal wave, pulling her into its depths. She could feel her body being consumed, her spirit being ripped from her. The souls were feeding on her, taking everything they could. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was the last sacrifice, the final piece they cheated to escape. And as the darkness swallowed her whole, she realized the ultimate truth. The honey hadn't preserved them. It had corrupted them. The spirits she had tried to save had become monsters, and she was their meal. The last thing Eleanor heard was the voice of Samuel, his words haunting her as she was lost to the abyss. "You thought you could save us, Eleanor. But we were never meant to be saved." But even as Eleanor disappeared into the darkness, the souls she had freed weren't done yet. The curse she had unleashed was just beginning to spread, and soon the world would see the true cost of her madness. The darkness within Eleanor's home was suffocating. The air was thick with the souls she had trapped, now freed but twisted into something far darker. The very walls of the house seemed to vibrate with their power, and the floors pulsed underfoot as if the house itself was alive. The sheriff's screams still echoed in the house, his mind shattered beyond repair as the spirits took control of everything around them. But it wasn't just Eleanor they were after anymore, it was the world. She had tried to play God. She had tried to preserve their souls, to cheat death, but in the end, it had consumed her. Her body was being slowly destroyed, her soul unraveling as the spirits she had trapped devoured everything she was. Yet even in the overwhelming madness, a single thought clung to the edges of her fraying consciousness. She had to stop it. She had to fix it. The spirit souls she had once loved, those she had once tried to save, are no longer just trapped inside their jars. They were in her mind, in her body, feeding on her very essence, but worse still, they were spreading. The curse was alive, and with each passing moment, it grew stronger, reaching further than Eleanor ever imagined. Desperation surged within her. She had made a terrible mistake. She had opened the floodgates, and now she had to close them. But how? The spirits were not just angry, they were hungry, and they were feeding. Each soul was a poison, a toxin slowly coursing through her veins, transforming her into something unrecognizable. The house, once a place of warmth and love, had become a tomb, a prison for the dead. Eleanor stumbled to the old cellar, the place where it had all started, the place where she had first tried to preserve Samuel's body. The jars were still there, some broken, others cracked, but all of them filled with the remnants of souls she couldn't escape. She grabbed one of the jars, Samuel sits glass cold against her fingers. But it wasn't just a jar. It was a portal, a gateway to the cursed hell she had unleashed. She knew what she had to do. She had to destroy the honey. She had to break the jars. But the souls, they wouldn't let her. The moment her hand touched the jar, she felt it. A wave of cold, of rage like nothing she had ever experienced washed over her. Samuel's voice, once soft and gentle, now screamed in her head, its pitch sharp and jarring, like nails on glass. "You can't undo what you've done, Eleanor," he hissed. "You've opened the door. You've let us free, and now you're going to pay." Her head spun with the force of his words. She could feel his spirit clawing at her, his presence choking her from within. And he wasn't the only one. The other souls were waking up inside her, pushing against the thin walls of her mind, clawing to get out. She could hear them all, their voices blending into a chorus of madness. John, Thomas, all of them, filling her head with their anger and their hunger. But there was something else, something darker. In the corner of the room, something began to move. Eleanor's eyes snapped to it, her breath catching in her throat. It was the honey that had been spilled when the jars had cracked, when the spirits had broken free. It had pooled on the floor, its golden hue now darkened, thickened with power. And it was alive. The honey began to swirl and pulse, rising like a living creature. The room grew colder, the air thick with an unnatural weight. The honey wasn't just feeding on the spirits, it was feeding on her too, on her fear, her desperation. It was no longer just a vessel for the dead. It was its own entity, a force of darkness, hungry for more. "No," Eleanor whispered, but it was too late. The honey surged forward, and before she could move, it wrapped itself around her, its sticky tendrils pulling at her limbs, crawling up her body like a snake. She screamed, trying to break free, but it was impossible. The honey was dragging her down, its weight crushing her. She could feel the spirits, the trapped souls, pushing against her from all directions. Their anger, their hunger, it was suffocating her. In the midst of the chaos, Eleanor's mind cleared for a moment. She saw it, the truth. The honey hadn't just preserved the souls, it had changed them. It had corrupted them, turning them into something far worse than human. And in doing so, it had corrupted her too. It had fed on her. It had fed on their souls, feeding on everything she had done in the name of preservation, feeding on her obsession, her desperation. The honey had become a parasite, a disease, and she had been its willing host. But she couldn't stop now. She had to stop it. For the world, for anyone left alive, she had to destroy the honey. She had to break the curse, no matter the cost. In a burst of strength, she reached for the broken jar that had once held Samuel's soul. She grasped it with both hands, pulling it toward her. The honey within it surged violently, as if it knew what she was planning. But Eleanor was beyond reason now. She had nothing left to lose. With all the force she could muster, she smashed the jar against the floor. The impact was deafening. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, the house shook. The walls trembled. The air itself seemed to quake, and Eleanor felt the weight of the souls pressing down on her. So many souls, so much anger. The honey began to boil, its golden hue shifting into something darker, more sinister. It was like the very essence of the souls was leaking out, spilling into the ground. But it wasn't enough. The curse hadn't broken. Eleanor collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her body racked with pain. She could feel the honey creeping up her legs, wrapping around her chest. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness was closing in, and the spirits were rising again. She couldn't stop them. She couldn't stop herself. And then, through the blackness, she saw someone, a figure standing in the doorway, a shadow that cut through the chaos. It was the sheriff. His face was pale, his eyes wild with fear. "Eleanor!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the spirits. "You have to finish this. You have to destroy it." Eleanor turned toward him, her mind spinning. She wanted to tell him it was too late, that she was already lost, but the words wouldn't come. And then the figure moved. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't anyone at all. It was the honey taking shape, becoming something monstrous, a massive dark shadow, swirling and twisting, its tendrils reaching out for her. "You started this, Eleanor," 1,000 voices whispered, "and now it's your turn to pay." And then everything went black. The honey wasn't finished with Eleanor, and neither were the souls. Eleanor's mind was lost to the darkness, her body entwined in the living honey, consumed by its power. It was a strange kind of paralysis. She was trapped, unable to move, her thoughts scattered like broken glass. The weight of the souls, the very ones she had tried to preserve, pressed down on her from every direction. The anger, the hunger, the rage, they filled her mind and overwhelmed her, leaving her gasping for breath. The spirits were taking over. They were no longer just trapped in jars. They were free, no longer bound by any force. And yet, in the midst of her torment, something within her snapped. Something survived. The hunger was still there, but so was the desire to end this, to fix it. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. The honey, the spirits, it wasn't just a curse. It was a connection, a bond forged by her own hands, a trap of her own making. She had believed that by preserving them, by keeping them with her, she was doing them a favor. But in truth, she had only strengthened their power, giving them more than they had ever had in life. And in doing so, she had created something far worse than death. In the stillness, the honey seemed to hum, vibrating beneath her skin. She could feel the souls moving within it, their essence pulling at her, taking from her. But in the moment of her realization, she saw the truth. The honey didn't just trap souls, it fed on them. And it fed on the living too. Eleanor had been feeding it all along. The realization was a knife to her chest. The souls were no longer merely victims of her obsession. They were alive in a way she had never understood. She wasn't the one controlling them. They were controlling her, and the honey was the key to their freedom. It had always been the key. Suddenly, the sensation of being trapped, of being consumed, became unbearable. Eleanor couldn't breathe. The honey clung to her skin like a suffocating shroud, pulling her deeper into its depths. She clawed at it, her hands shaking, trying to break free, but it was useless. The spirits were feeding on her fear, on her panic, growing stronger with each passing moment. They were becoming more powerful, more alive. The house groaned, the walls shaking as if the very structure was buckling under the weight of the spirit's fury. But just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she felt a strange pulse beneath Hera shift, a momentary crack in the darkness. She could hear something, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Help her. At first, she thought it was just another fragment of her mind, another delusion. But then the whisper came again, louder this time. Help her before it's too late. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. The voice, Samuel's voice, was unmistakable, but it wasn't coming from the honey. It was coming from within her, a presence deeper than the souls around her. She gasped, her breath ragged, as she tried to focus on the voice. "Samuel?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Is it really you?" For a brief moment there was silence. The spirits around her seemed to pull away, their voices fading just enough for her to hear the quiet clarity of Samuel's words. But Eleanor, you must act quickly. The honey has taken on a life of its own. It has become too powerful. The souls you've trapped there feeding it, making it stronger. The longer you wait, the harder it will be to stop. Eleanor's heart raced. She could feel the honey tightening around her, pulling her in further. But the voice in her mind, Samuel's, was all that mattered. The last remnants of her sanity clung to it. "What do I do?" she begged. "How do I stop it? Destroy the source, break the honey, destroy what binds us. The curse is within the honey, Eleanor, but you have the power to end it. You always have." The realization hit her like a slap to the face. She had been blind, trapped in her obsession with preserving life, with keeping the souls near, not understanding that she had created something far worse than death. The honey wasn't just a medium, it was a conduit to a new reality, a twisted existence where the souls didn't die, but lived in a nightmare that fed on them forever. She had become the keeper of something that should have never existed. Eleanor's mind began to clear, the haze lifting as she fought to regain control. The honey was trying to drag her back, trying to consume her, but she resisted, her resolve hardening. The jars had to be destroyed. That was the key. They had been the source of the curse, and they had to be broken, every single one of them. The spirits inside them would never be freed as long as the honey remained, with everything she had left. Eleanor pushed against the wall of honey, summoning the last of her strength. She could feel the honey's resistance, but this time, she was determined. This time, the spirits couldn't control her anymore. This time, she would break the cycle. She gritted her teeth, summoning the rage of every victim she had ever trapped, and finally, with one last, desperate scream, she forced herself free from the sticky, suffocating grip. The house shook violently, the energy in the room spiraling out of control, but Eleanor wasn't backing down. She was fighting for her life. She was fighting for the souls that had been consumed. She was fighting to stop the curse before it claimed everyone. The floor beneath her feet cracked as she lunged toward the nearest jar. Her hands, covered in honey, trembled, but her resolve was stronger than the fear. With a sudden movement, she smashed the jar onto the floor. The explosion of honey and glass was deafening, but something shifted. The energy in the room began to change. The spirits howled in rage, but it was as if their power was fading. The honey had lost its grip on them. Eleanor, gasping for breath, staggered back. The room was spinning and her vision blurred. She felt weak more than she ever had in her life. But she couldn't stop. The curse wasn't over. The honey was still alive. The jars still remained. She reached for another jar, this time Samuel's. Her hands were slick with the sticky liquid, but she didn't care. She had to finish it. With one final push, she shattered the jar. The air seemed to crack with a strange tension. The honey began to evaporate, dissolving into the air like smoke. The spirits, no longer trapped, screamed in fury as they were torn apart by the breaking of the jars. They were free, but not in the way Eleanor had imagined. They were free, yes, but they were also lost, gone, scattered into the winds, unable to find rest, unable to escape the chaos of their eternal suffering. And Eleanor, she had no time to mourn their fate. The honey, now destroyed, had finally lost its power. As the last remnants of the honey dissipated into the air, Eleanor collapsed to the floor, exhausted, her body finally giving into the strain. The room fell silent, the weight of what had just occurred heavy in the air. But Eleanor knew the truth now. She had destroyed the curse, and in doing so, she had freed herself. But even as the last of the honey disappeared, Eleanor felt a dark presence linger in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The curse might have been broken, but it had left its mark. The house had fallen eerily silent after Eleanor had broken the final jar. The spirits that had once screamed in agony and fury now lay still, as though they had been stilled by some unseen force. The honey, now evaporated into nothingness, left an unsettling void, a silence that felt wrong. Eleanor, weakened and exhausted, collapsed onto the cold, cracked floor. Her body ached from the strain, and her mind was a haze of memories and shattered realities. But the silence was deceptive. It was not the silence of peace, but the calm before a storm. Eleanor tried to push herself to her feet, but it was no use. Her limbs were heavy, her body shaking as if the weight of everything she had done had finally caught up to her. The spirits were gone, weren't they? She had broken the jars, shattered the source of the curse, and yet something gnawed at her, a cold feeling creeping into her bones. She should have known. She should have known better than to think it was over. A faint whisper reached her ears. At first, it was so soft that she couldn't be sure if it was real. But then, the whispers grew louder, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The voices were back, but they weren't the same voices. They weren't the angry, vengeful spirits she had trapped in the honey. These voices were different. They were softer, more sinister, more calm. "You've freed us, Eleanor," the voice of Samuel echoed, his tone now laced with something darker. "But you've freed something much worse than you can imagine." Eleanor's heart stopped. Samuel was unmistakable, but it wasn't the voice of the man she had loved. This was a mockery, a twisted version of him, a remnant of the curse that had been unleashed. The very essence of what she had created had taken on a life of its own. The honey, the spirits had not been freed. They had evolved, grown into something far more dangerous. Eleanor tried to stand, her legs trembling, but she was too weak. The whispering grew louder, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to shift. The walls groaned as though something was pushing against them from the inside. The house felt alive, like it was shaking off the remnants of the curse, but in doing so, it was becoming something else. It was becoming part of the storm that was about to break. The air in the room grew thick with the weight of the spirits, but now they were not merely voices, they were presence. They were more than the souls she had trapped. They were the manifestation of her actions. Each soul, each curse had festered, transformed into an unstoppable force of rage, hunger, and darkness. And now, it was rising. The souls were no longer lost in the honey, they had become the honey. The first sign of the storm came in the form of a shudder. The house vibrated, and a low rumble shook the floor, like the earth itself was responding to the soul's awakening. Eleanor gasped as a gust of cold wind blew through the room, swirling around her, knocking over the remnants of shattered jars. The wind howled as if it was alive, pulling at her, tearing at her mind. The walls groaned louder, and the whispers no longer distant turned into screams. From the broken jars, the honey started to bubble again, rising from the shards like a dark liquid tendril. It moved like a living creature, swirling and twisting as if it had a will of its own. Eleanor stared, unable to look away, even as the honey began to crawl across the floor, inching toward her. Her pulse quickened, and she tried to move, but the honey was everywhere. It was in the walls, it was in the air, it was in her mind. "No," she screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. The honey began to pool around her, its golden color now dark and thick, swirling into inky blackness. The spirits were no longer just voices in her head, they were presence. She could feel them pressing against her, their thoughts, their desires, their hunger. They weren't seeking freedom anymore. They were seeking destruction. The souls she had freed weren't grateful. They weren't peaceful. They were hungry, and they were coming for her. "You thought you could stop us?" a voice echoed. This one not Samuel's. It was the voice of Thomas, the first soul she had trapped, now distorted and monstrous. "You thought you could control us with your jars?" Eleanor's vision blurred as the darkness in the room deepened. She felt the honey rising around her ankles, pulling at her. It was too powerful now. The souls had fed. They had consumed everything, the honey, the energy, her own fear, and in doing so, they had become something far worse. They were no longer just trapped, they were free in the worst way possible. And then, the storm hit. The walls of the house began to shake violently, the floor splitting beneath Eleanor's feet. The honey surged upward, swallowing the room whole, engulfing her. She screamed, but the sound was lost in the roar of the storm as the house seemed to collapse in on itself, the very foundation crumbling under the weight of the spirit's wrath. The storm outside intensified, but it wasn't just an ordinary storm. It was as if the very heavens had joined the chaos below. The sky cracked open, and the wind howled with an unnatural fury. It was the storm of the souls, a storm born from Eleanor's curse, a storm that would not stop until it had claimed everything. Eleanor's body was pulled deeper into the honey, its tendrils wrapping around her, suffocating her. The spirits were everywhere now, in the walls, in the air, in her very blood. They were inside her. They were a part of her. "No," she screamed one last time, but her voice was drowned out by the fury around her. And just as she thought she would be consumed entirely, a single moment of clarity hit her. The honey, the curse, the storm. It wasn't the souls that were the true enemy. It was her. It was the choices she had made. It was her obsession that had brought this upon everyone. She had created this nightmare, and now she was part of it. In her final, desperate attempt to stop the storm, Eleanor reached out to the spirits, trying to connect with them one last time. She reached into the darkness, trying to break the cycle, but the storm only grew fiercer. But even as the storm reached its peak, a strange stillness washed over the house. For a fleeting moment, the wind stopped howling, the walls stopped shaking, the spirits, in all their rage and fury, seemed to pause. And then, Eleanor understood. It was never about the honey. It was about the choices she made. She had tried to control the uncontrollable. She had tried to cheat death, and in doing so, had unleashed a force she could never hope to defeat. And now, it was too late. The storm, the curse, the spirits were her legacy, and they would never be stopped. But as the storm subsided, Eleanor's fate was sealed. The souls had risen, and the true cost of her actions would echo across the land for generations to come. Eleanor's world was nothing but a blur now. The honey, the storm, the souls, everything had merged into an unstoppable force, an entity that was no longer bound by time or space. She had done what she could to fight it, but the curse of her own making, had claimed her entirely. The spirits were everywhere, inside her, around her. She had become part of the storm she had tried so desperately to control. But now, something new stirred within the chaos. The house, once a crumbling ruin, had changed. The walls no longer trembled from the force of the souls. They had become solid. The air no longer crackled with energy. It was as though the storm itself had settled, taking root in the very fabric of the land. Eleanor's body was still, her breath shallow, but her mind was awake, watching the reality around her shift. It was then that she realized the souls had stopped raging. They weren't fighting anymore. They were waiting for something. Eleanor felt it, like a shift in the air. A new presence was creeping into the storm, something darker than the souls that had once surrounded her. This presence was not filled with anger, it was calm, but there was something far more terrifying in that calmness. It was ancient, like the stillness before a storm, but it carried the weight of an inevitable end. She could feel it in the marrow of her bones. The souls, once twisted by the honey, now hovered above her, motionless. Their whispers had died down. The storm that had raged for so long was silenced. It was as if a powerful force had taken command of the souls, forcing them into stillness. Then the presence spoke. "You thought you could stop it," said the voice. It wasn't Samuel's. It wasn't any of the souls she had trapped. It was something other. The voice was cold, almost indifferent, and yet it carried an undeniable weight, a sense of finality. Eleanor's body tensed, her heart pounding as she tried to understand. "What are you?" she managed to whisper, though her voice was barely audible. "I am the final reckoning," the voice responded, its tone chilling. "I am what has come to collect the price for what you have unleashed." Eleanor's breath caught. She understood then. The storm, the honey, the souls were never the true cost of her actions. They were just the beginning. In an instant, Eleanor was no longer in the house. She was standing in a dark void, surrounded by the spirits she had once tried to save. Their faces were twisted in agony, but their eyes no longer held anger. They were empty, resigned. And standing before her was the true source of the curse, the final force that had always been behind the honey, behind the souls. The dark entity, once a presence on the fringes of the storm, now stood before her in its true form. It wasn't a spirit. It wasn't a soul. It was something far more ancient, an entity that existed beyond the physical world, beyond even death itself. It was the embodiment of sacrifice, the price for tampering with life and death. "You have crossed a line, Eleanor," the entity intoned. "The honey, the spirits, they were just the beginning. Your obsession with controlling life, preserving it, there is a cost to that. A cost you have now paid." Eleanor staggered back, her mind reeling. She understood now. The honey hadn't been the source of the curse. It had been a conduit, a way to open the door. But what she had unleashed was far worse than anything she could have imagined. The entity standing before her was the true force that governed life and death. The souls, the spirits had been bound to its will all along. "Please," Eleanor whispered. her voice trembling with desperation. "What do you want from me?" The entity tilted its head slightly, as if considering her question. "What I want is simple," it said softly. "You will be the final soul, the last to be collected." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. The last soul, her soul, the storm she had unleashed, the curse she had created, had all led to this moment. The spirits around her, once angry, once desperate for release, were now silent, their eyes hollow, as if they had already accepted their fate. She was the final piece, the cost of her actions, the last sacrifice to close the door. The honey, the curse, the spirits, they had all been building to this. You'll never get me," Eleanor gasped, struggling to find the strength to fight back. But it was useless. She felt herself weakening, her body growing cold. "I have already taken what was necessary," the entity replied, its voice now filled with a quiet finality. "And now, you will join them." Eleanor's vision blurred. She felt her soul being torn from her body, the weight of the curse pressing down on her. But just as the darkness closed in, something unexpected happened. The souls, the very ones she had trapped, reached out to her, their hands once cold and empty now filled with a strange warmth. "You have freed us, Eleanor," said a voice, a familiar voice, Samuel's voice. But it wasn't the angry, twisted version of him. It was the voice she had longed to hear. His tone was soft, calm, even forgiving. "You've made the ultimate sacrifice. You have freed us all." And in that moment, Eleanor understood. Her actions had come full circle. The souls had been freed, but at a cost. She was the one who had to pay it. She was the last soul, the final piece of the curse that had unraveled. But her sacrifice was not in vain. She had in the end set them free. Her body dissolved into a dark void, her soul slipping into the eternal night. But for the first time in her life, she felt at peace. And as Eleanor's soul faded into the dark abyss, the storm that had once consumed her began to die down. But in the distance, a new storm, even darker, even more powerful, began to brew. The storm that had once torn through Eleanor's house and the land around it began to settle. The winds died down, the air grew still, and the earth seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The curse, it seemed, had finally been broken. The spirits that had once roamed free, full of rage and hunger, were gone, their fury no longer echoing through the house. And for a moment, everything seemed to be at peace. But peace was an illusion, a fleeting dream in the aftermath of the nightmare Eleanor had unleashed. The darkness had not entirely dissipated. The souls, the spirits, they had not been fully freed. Something still lingered, something much darker than anything Eleanor could have imagined. As Eleanor's soul faded into the abyss, she felt the coldness that had consumed her begin to lift. She was free, yes, but not in the way she had hoped. The entity that had collected her soul had not been a mere consequence of her actions. It was a force older than time, a presence that had always watched over the curse, waiting for the final soul to be taken. And now that soul had been claimed. The void around her was infinite, endless. It stretched out in all directions, a sea of darkness with no light, no escape. Eleanor felt herself suspended in it, drifting, but she could no longer feel the weight of her body. She was nothing but a soul, empty and adrift, her once familiar sense of self slipping away. She was no longer Eleanor the widow. She was part of the very curse she had created. But as her mind began to numb, a strange sensation washed over her. A shift, a pull, the sensation of being watched. Her awareness sharpened for a fleeting moment as the veil of darkness around her began to crack. In the distance, a faint light appeared, a pinpoint of illumination in the vast emptiness. And from that light, a figure began to emerge. Eleanor couldn't make out the details at first, just a dark silhouette against the brightness. But as it drew closer, she felt an unsettling recognition. It was Samuel, but not the twisted version she had heard in her mind, not the version that had condemned her. This Samuel was different. He was calm, serene, even glowing with an inner light that seemed to push against the darkness. "You've paid the price, Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle. "But this was never truly about the honey. It was about you." Eleanor's breath caught in her non-existent chest. I don't understand. I thought I freed you. I thought I ended it." "You freed us, yes," Samuel said with a soft smile. "But you also freed yourself. The honey was never the key, Eleanor. You were." Eleanor's mind reeled. "What do you mean? I thought I was the one who trapped you. Trapped us all." Samuel's form grew clearer, his face filled with both love and sorrow. "No, Eleanor, you didn't trap us. You thought you were saving us, preserving us in honey. But you were actually trying to hold on to something you couldn't. You were trying to control death itself, and that was your undoing." The weight of his words hit her like a tidal wave. She had tried to control life and death. She had thought that by preserving the souls, by holding them close, she could undo loss. But in doing so, she had invited something far worse. "You were the collector all along, Eleanor," Samuel continued, his tone soft but firm. "The moment you started preserving, you sealed your fate, and now you are part of the collection, just like us. But we're not angry anymore. We're free." Eleanor could feel it then, the weight lifting. The curse wasn't the souls. The curse wasn't the honey. The curse had always been the need to control, the need to fight against the inevitable. Her actions had made her the last soul to be collected, the last sacrifice. But it was her own release, her acceptance, that set her free. And as Samuel's form began to fade into the light, she felt her spirit fade with him. The last echoes of her name were carried away by the wind, vanishing into the vastness of eternity. The storm, the curse, the honey, it had all come to an end. Eleanor was no longer the widow. She was no longer the collector. She was free. But as the light swallowed her, a new darkness stirred. It had been quiet for so long, but now it whispered in the shadows, waiting. The storm had ended for Eleanor, but for others it was only just beginning. The curse wasn't gone. It was merely dormant, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to try and trap the dead. Final payoff, Eleanor's soul had been claimed, her curse broken, but the storm wasn't truly over. The entity that had watched over her actions, the force she had unleashed, wasn't bound to her anymore. It lingered, patient, waiting. The honey, the souls, the darkness, none of it had truly ended. It had merely paused. As Eleanor's spirit faded into the void, a faint whisper echoed through the darkness. This is only the beginning. The storm that had consumed her house was now nothing more than a distant memory, but it left its mark. The honey, the curse, the twisted soulset was never about Eleanor alone. It was about the eternal hunger, the force that would always seek to collect those who dared to tamper with life and death. And somewhere out there, another soul would soon step into the void, unknowingly becoming the next collector. The cycle would begin again.